Just taking a quick look at the motor. The two-spring motor from the Victrola the 6th VI. Nothing unusual. It's a fairly standard late teens into the 1920 style motor. A little bit smaller than what you're going to find in the 9, but it is comparable to the 8. The springs aren't very big, as you can see. They're not huge. There's 2 of them. These spring barrels, you can actually put a bigger spring in them if you want to. I've done that when I had to repair broken ones. But these springs are good. There's nothing wrong with them. They seem okay. So we're going to leave them be. Put them back in and give them a test. If they can't push through a record, well, then we'll replace them. These are original springs. Let's see which one has the better stamping on it so you can see it. Probably help if I turn it around the other way. Let's see. A little bit of a sun glare, but I think you can probably see that on there. That's the Victor mark. Now, that doesn't mean that they've been in there since 1918. They could have been replaced in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s. These springs remained in inventory for quite a while after the shutdown of the Victor company. You could still find them, you know, and eventually, I guess, demand petered off, so there wasn't too much call for them, but you can still find them. Even today, you look on eBay, sometimes they do pop up a spring here and there. When you do replace springs, though, you want to do them in sets, so I'm happy to see that these are a matching set. They have the same markings on them. And about average from what I see. You know, this is the style, being in the late teens. It has the hook here. The hook style on the end. And the bend right there that catches the arbor in the middle. That's common to all of the Victor springs during this period. The earlier ones had an oval hole here that went into an eye in the side of the barrel and wound up, and there was another eye on the arbor. Not as easy to deal with. These are much quicker to deal with, easier. So that was an improvement. When Victor did things, they didn't do it because they wanted to make a cheap product or anything like that. They did it because it sped up production, and it was easier. It was just easy. It made things faster. They could make machines faster. These machines were in constant demand, so anything they could do, just like Henry Ford with the Model T. Improvements that were made weren't because they wanted to make a better piece of crap or whatever. They wanted to streamline the process, improve it. They were into improving. Today, it's all about making things as cheap as possible and pushing them out. And if they last 3 to 5 years, oh wow, that's great, you know. But these machines were built to last a millennia, and they're doing a pretty good job getting there already. Most of them, well, let's see, the Victor factory closed in 1929, so you know, they're getting really close. They're 9 years away from every Victrola and Victor product being 100. So, or 10 years rather. Well, no, 9 years and a few months. Look at some of the parts. Yeah, this is the spring barrel for the 2 springs, the one piece. You can see the little hooks in there. There is room. Like I said, you could put bigger springs in these if you wanted to. You don't really need to. But if you wanted to play, say, more sides of a record on one wind, I guess you could do it. But the Victor company reserved the larger springs for the bigger, more expensive machines, like the 9 and the floor models and all of that. The 6 and the 8 both had the small 2-spring motor like this, but they were lower priced machines. You know, they weren't at the top tier of the pricing, so you didn't get big springs in those. You got adequate ones that would do the job, but you're still going to have to wind it a little bit more, that's all. No surprises in all the gears. These is your typical gears, and that's the governor right there. And these are, you know, what they have. And then you can tell. One thing that always gets me with these, that's 102 years old, and it really is no wear to speak of on there that I can see with the naked eye. I thought there was a little bit on this, but there really isn't. Now, I don't believe that these machines were not used that much. They were very expensive. Even the smallest one was still expensive by the standards of the time. So if somebody bought something like this, they bought it to use it. They were going to play it. And remember, they didn't have a lot of options. They couldn't just flick on the TV or the radio and, you know, or anything like that. Or just, you could go and see a live performance, but that cost even more money. So, and time. And they weren't always around. So Victrola, if you wanted to listen to music, that was pretty much your only options. If you bought one, you're probably going to use it. So when you see these things with such, I mean, every now and then I'll find a gear with a little bit of wear. I've never found one yet that was worn to the point where it was unusable. Even the brass gears, look at that. Look at the teeth on that. There's no wear. There's no wear. And this machine had not been lubricated in a long time. By the look of things, I don't think it was getting decent lubrication, because just wasn't enough caked on crud on there. It was more dirt than the actual grease and crud. And it was very dry. The inside of the spring barrel had a little bit of caked on old black graphite and just no lubrication at all. When I wound it up when I first got it, it was clang, 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 clang. You know, you hear it rubbing together. You hear that, that's not good. You know, that means that there's just nothing in there. It's dry as a bone. You can see how the spring is a little scuffed from that. Not from me doing it, but just over the years of it being done. Some of the bluing is worn off it, and some of that's normal, but some of it looks like scratching, and that's from dry grease. But that's all right. Then we'll put new grease in there. We get it all greased and lubricated. There'll be plenty of lubrication on it, so that's not going to be an issue. And there's the frame, the cast frame. Now, Victor had 2-spring motors going all the way back to the very earliest days. I mean, that was the one way they could put more power into a motor, and then they could advertise that it was better somehow than the motor in the cheaper machine. This was how they would do it. They would put an extra spring in there. Sometimes 1 extra spring, sometimes 2, sometimes 3. You could end up with, you know, a 4-spring model, you know, in there. In the early days, they would stack cans one on top of the other. In later times, they would use 1 or 2 spring barrels to do that. But really, the design here is not all that different from the very first Victrola in 1900 Victrola motors. You know, just improved to speedline production, to make them more compact, you know, maybe a little more powerful, that kind of thing. But they all had similar style of governor, number of gears. You know, the springs don't really change a whole lot. Some get thicker, some get narrower, some have oval holes, and some have hooks. But they're all a flat coiled spring. So you can always tell a Victor Motors parts from other manufacturers. They all pretty much have the same look about them. And they're such nice motors to work with. I love working with Victors, particularly. A lot of the off-brands had to work around Victor patents on their motors, or had motors made by third parties that had to work around Victor patents because they didn't want to pay. You know, each patent you used, you had to pay Victor Company or the Edison Company for the right to use them. They were the first, and they had the best patents. And a lot of companies didn't want to do that. And if you got caught doing it, and some tried to skirt the rules and use the patent anyway without paying, they got caught. Victor had Eldridge Johnson had an army of lawyers who existed just for that. The minute they detected it, they went after it, they won, they got damages, they ended up owning some, you know, some company somewhere, whatever, that didn't actually make phonographs, but just used parts to put them together, whatever. But they tried to skirt around it and found other ways around using the patent. And this resulted in motors that are just not as easy to deal with. They don't come apart as easy. They don't last as long. They're not as efficient as Victor motors are, or Edison. Edison's pretty good too. I don't really work a lot with Edisons, but I am familiar somewhat with them. So I own an Edison. Actually, I own a couple of them, but it's Victor's where I like to play. This is where I'm happiest. So, and always nice to see a motor that's actually not damaged and bashed up and broken springs and all that stuff. This is just going to be, I'll finish cleaning it, put it all back together, grease it up nice, and it's going to spin just perfect. I'm debating whether or not to totally rebuild the governor. Really, the governor springs don't look that bad. I'm going to take it apart and check them over to make sure they not kinked in the middle or cracked. I like to use original Victor governor springs wherever I find them in good condition, because I think they're better than the repops. I don't know why, but they always seem to work a little bit better. I like to use them. But if they're kinked and bent, I don't know, or anything like that in the middle there, underneath the weight, if there's any problems with them, then they have to go, and you never just do one spring, you do all three. All three have to be changed so they're all equal strength. You don't want one weak spring and 2 strong springs, or 1 strong spring. You don't want that. And one thing I've already noticed on this, I don't know if I can get it to do it here. Let's get close up here. See how that's moving? That's moving because this tiny little screw right here is a little bit loose. If you tighten this screw, always be very careful doing it. It's a tiny steel screw, and it's in a brass body. That goes for all the governor screws. You always check governor screws for tightness. But you just gently, you know, tighten them a little bit. You don't try to overdo it, because if you do, you will snap a screw, you'll strip out a body, and you'll have to rethread it, or, you know, something like that. or you'll bugger the head up. You don't want to do that. Usually the springs are tight from the factory, they're fine, but this one, that little one right there, that one always likes to loosen up. And if it loosens up enough, this body will come loose and it'll slide right into the gear. That gear. And it's going to cause a problem. You'll end up damaging something. So you always want to check that. Every now and then I find one that's loose. Not an everyday occurrence, but every now and then one will turn up loose. That's why you always check these screws. Just to make sure they're snugged on there good, that's all. You know, you wiggle the weights. So the weight's loose. No, they're not. There's no looseness there indicating a loose screw. You know, it's good. Because if this flies apart, it's usually pretty spectacular. You don't want to be in the way of one of those weights flying through the air. Inside the case of the phonograph, it's probably not going to do too much damage because you're talking about mahogany or solid oak, and it's going to absorb it. But you know, if you're, say, have the motor up in the air and you're servicing one and you're spinning it like we all do to make sure everything's working right, and one of those springs snaps and that weight comes off, yeah, it's going to fly, and probably you're going to end up spending 2 hours chasing it around the room trying to find it. Okay, there you go. A look at the Victor 6's motor. Victrola, the 6th motor. I always do that. Victrola, the 6th. There is a Victor 6. It's an outside horn machine. It's rare and very expensive. This is definitely not it. The Victrola, the 6th. Okay.